Well, hello and welcome to 5 critical questions to ask or investigate when you consider a hybrid event using Hopin. My name is Roger Corville, and welcome to another episode of V2's Thought Leader Conversations series. And the question on the table today is, why might a couple old-timers in the virtual events business, who both have backgrounds in the music concerts business, have to share about getting your hybrid event off the ground with on the right foot? Well, you know, at V2, we specialize in pairing specialized use cases with particular platforms. And today we're going to do that in the case of one use case and one platform, hybrid events using Hopin. And of course, you know my partner in crime, founder and co-founder and CEO, Aaron Cole. And Aaron, welcome back. Great to be back and just having a cup of coffee with you today.
Yeah, likewise. I always enjoy these times. Thanks for having me.
You know, to begin with, we probably should just set the table, right? What Hopin does, just in case people are like, Hopin, I've never heard of that. And to be fair, there's 100, how many platforms out there on the market? But give me the 50,000 foot of Hopin, and maybe even why it really became dominant during COVID.
Yeah, great question, and I think great way to start out. Hopin, if you're not for those of you that are not familiar with Hopin is a virtual event platform. There are, Roger, as you just said a minute ago, there are literally hundreds of them that are out there. Hopin was one of the first ones come 2018, 2019, as we were getting towards COVID, to really start to rethink from an initial design perspective, focusing on content and attendee interaction as the primaries. A lot of the other older legacy platforms that we had been using and had been dominant in the industry were very focused on the user experience. So like immersive 3D environments, talking about Legacy and Expo, Intrado, Unisphere, Six Connect, where as much of anything as an attendee, you are a part of an environment. Hopin's take on this was a little bit different, where they were looking at, again, understanding the value of the content and the value of the attendee interactions, which, as we have talked before, Roger, is two of the more important things that we feel are going to lead to direct success of an event, be it a webinar, be it a streaming webcast, or again, in this case, a virtual environment. And so that was their play, and they natively built that from the ground up with that in mind. A lot of the older legacy platforms were also going in that same direction, but for them, it's a little bit harder to make that transition, right? Because, you know, they're carrying, in some cases, decades worth of code that's underneath the platforms that we're running, and it's not necessarily an easy lift for them to just make that change. And so that was kind of the main thing of what Hopin did and why it was successful. I do think just with the way that the market was changing, they would have had traction and they would have had growth in the market regardless. But COVID blew everything up, obviously, in our environment, and that was really what launched them forward, light years ahead of where they likely would have been.
Yeah, well, and you actually brought up something that I'll just put an exclamation point behind, and I'll even use an analogy to do it. Zoom, in the sense of how long you and I have been in this business, Zoom was a later comer, right?
Absolutely.
But here are these engineers who left WebEx, and if we all sat down and said, hey, what are the essentials that we have to get right? We strip away, like you say, the legacy technical debt, the long-term code. And is it really important if somebody walks into something that looks like Second Life? Remember Second Life? What do we have to get right? And to your point, content and connecting people is that critical thing in a way that then doesn't cost you $200,000, right? Because I mean, a lot of those things were pretty cool, but I mean, they came with a lot of zeros on the price tag too.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I'm glad you even brought that up, because in that, I think, was magnified when COVID changed our market in the world, because suddenly, you know, normally it would be very common for us to stand up a virtual environment using like an older platform or a more traditional platform, let me put it that way, 3-4 months of building, design, and placement, and really designing that environment. we were having clients come to us needing to stand something up in a period of 3 to 4 weeks. And that would almost be impossible with these larger environments. That's what Hopin really kind of pioneered in some ways.
Yeah. And in a way they've only made it better. But that's a killer point that you just made. Because, the good news is they got a big old tailwind called COVID, and they got another $800 million in a couple rounds of funding, and they acquired StreamYard, which brought some really cool stuff to the table. But today we're here to talk about hybrid events and kind of focusing in on 5 questions, just so that I'm just going to look you right in the eye at the camera. If you are in hybrid events already, I presume probably you are, or you're going, well, wait a minute, if we were going to start over and do this right, what would we be asking? So here's a couple guys with backgrounds in the in-person events, rock and roll business, as well as having been in this for decades, and bringing those together. I guess the first question on the table is, how do we gamify the virtual attendee experience? Right? Put this in the context of the people that you're inviting, and you want them to have something that is unforgettable as an experience.
Right.
Where do we start?
Right. Absolutely. Well, and gamification is really nothing more than what it sounds like. It's finding ways to add interaction, fun, games to what normally might be a pretty stale, dull environment. And so whenever you think about that magic word of gamification, it really is designed. And the goal is to get people off their hands and get them participating in the environment. And so in a sense, from a definition standpoint, anything that you can do to add those levels of activity or interaction can be thought of as a sense of gamification. We spend a lot of time, and this is especially in relation to the Hopin environment, coming up with ways to add gamification to what is going on, because it is a direct link to better attendee interaction, and attendees almost always will end up taking more out of the environment if that is a present part of the environment itself. So even adding things like as simple as adding leaderboards, for example. So we've all been out where we've seen current leaders listed on a leaderboard. Having something like that where you've got that tied to some sort of level of interaction or trivia or something like that is actually a part of the virtual environment, and then having people compete for that. That's a very basic way that you can add that level of gamification and have that be something that's really going to engage people, especially like sales type conferences where, they're naturally competitive. If your audience is that type of an environment or that type of a group, finding ways where you can have that level of competition, friendly competition, is a great way to go to get people off their seats. Even thinking about giveaways or contests or trivia, making trivia that is relevant to your market and to your crowd can be hugely beneficial, because you're encouraging interaction and you're encouraging participation with the audience. I know we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but there's quite a bit of other elements of integrations that you can do that will provide additional levels of gamification. But really, it all boils down to that very basic idea of thinking through and coming up with ways to make it fun, make it memorable, and get people to actually participate in the event.
Yeah. And one of the things that, just so that you, the listener, know where we're going, we're going to get to talking about bridging the gap between the virtual experience and the in-person experience. So sit tight. But to begin with, I think oftentimes, this is just my own observation, oftentimes the rightful appreciation of the in-person experience often means that we leave out the online attendees, or that's a second level thought, instead of thinking about them as primary. And I'm just going to make a prediction and sit tight. Sometime between now and the end of the year, Aaron and I are going to do another session where we just talk about some of the future of this event business, virtual event business, for our whole time together. But imagine you have an in-person event that's got, 500 people in it. But what happens when your virtual audience grows from the from the few who couldn't make it to your in-person event to 1,000 or 5,000.
Yeah.
Now, how important is it to accommodate both and make both experiences equally engaging, and then thinking about how to bridge that? I'll give you one example. Client that I worked with where as the MC, one of the things that they had were like, well, in their case, they had this little dragonfly that was in various places throughout the event, and you had to go find it, right? Kind of like the virtual version of bingo card,
Yeah.
which was to incent participating with vendors or, going into other places on the event website. But here's one example of one that I thought was particularly insightful, which was to say, not only where do we bring them together, meaning the in-person and online, but where do we do things that are unique for the online crew, right? So for instance, when the in-person crew is taking a break, what do we do for the online crew? Well, of course, we could put up a timer and give them a break too, but we also integrated like on the fly, like person on the street interviews, where we would grab someone from the in-person audience and just say, put them in front of the camera and start doing an interview uniquely for the online people that the people in the onsite crew weren't getting. And that also included some scheduled stops where there were some spots where, like during a couple segments, you could tune into that. And that was an interview with one of the speakers that was doing one of the breakouts. So there was actually something unique to being online. Wouldn't call it better or different, just different, but thinking those things through to think about your virtual event attendee experience as important as the in-person thing, stops the game. I think that's a game changer, right? I mean, it changes that from them being some passive fly on the wall going, oh man, I wish I was in Las Vegas with everybody, to going, well, no, we're having our own experience and interactions in addition to watching the keynotes and breakouts and that kind of thing.
Exactly it. And it's very common. Hybrid, that's obviously what we're here to talk about today. Hybrid. That's the key buzzword of our world right now because of this need to have both physical and virtual. And I always kind of look at it from a standpoint of, again, as you just exactly called out, Roger, you've got the physical audience, you got a fence, you got the virtual audience, and there is always going to be that barrier between the two. But you really want to make sure that you're taking steps, you're thinking through, you're coming up with ways to minimize or create a bridge over that fence so that you are mitigating that separation of the audience. And if you don't, the other thing, maybe even a better way to think about it too, is that if you start your planning understanding that both of those populations are equally important to you, then there's less of a chance that one of those populations is going to be left with a less than desirable experience. And that usually is the online audience. So it definitely starts from the very beginning in terms of planning and designing it, but thinking through ways that you can engage that audience that is both audiences, physically on site as well as online is hugely important. The other thing, or go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that's a great transition to the next question. How can we help people connect both on-site and online? Keep on going.
That is a great transition. One thing I was going to say that I think is important, and we haven't really touched on this a huge amount here yet, but when we talk about networking, you had mentioned a few minutes ago, Roger, about during downtimes of the physical audience, making sure that you're providing something for the virtual audience to do. That's fantastic. That's an awesome use of that time. We've encouraged with our clients to actually insert in their agendas networking breaks or times like that, which again are specifically designed to reinforce that interaction that you would normally get if everybody was in a room together. But obviously in our world, it's going to be a hybrid event where you've got both groups of audiences. So that's another element that we have seen works fairly well. you have to look at this from a engagement standpoint. That's the biggest thing. When we're talking about finding ways to make sure that both groups of audiences are going to be equally heard and equally participatory on the event. And so it can even be something as simple as making sure that you are coaching your presenters, making sure that you are engaging and taking live questions from the audience. Make sure those are read out loud up at the podium so that there is that buy-in from the online audience, that they know they're not just going to be sitting in the back of the room from a single camera feed, for example, and just kind of passively listening. That's going to be the first clue to someone that really this might not be worth their time if you're attending it from a virtual standpoint.
And you know, I'm going to hit something at a fairly high level, realizing that the devil's in the details, and that some part of that just happens when we have a conversation with you, the potential client, to kind of figure out how we take your dreams and visions and values and make those a reality. But you know, one of the things that's built into the Hopin platform that's actually really special is this virtual networking, virtual speed dating, if you will, that actually is kind of cool because you can set the algorithm to pair people based on common interest or title or some things that they have in their profile. And it will automatically drop you in, and you're just like, bam, oh, who are you? And it's got their name and their profile, and it says, all right, you got 5 minutes to talk to each other, or 3 minutes or whatever. And then it zips you off to the next person. Well, bridging that from online to offline, you know, could be something that is, say, an encouragement in advance to have all attendees download the Hopin smartphone app so that they can see each other's profiles and connect with each other in a way that's appropriate. And I love the way that they then make it really easy for me to connect on LinkedIn just by pushing a button like right there on the spot. But here's a really important thing to think about, and I'm probably getting too far ahead here. Those are the kind of things that you want to think about up front, not have the online thing be an afterthought, and we just tell the on-site AV crew where to you know, pipe their video feed, because we're going to want to communicate that in invitations and confirmation emails, and maybe even prep speakers in terms of how they facilitate those kinds of things, or those kinds of things that take a little planning up front. But if we don't know what we're doing up front, then online just happens to be an afterthought, when really our goal is to bridge that gap as best we can.
Right. It really, really starts with registration. You know, everything in our industry is that's the first trigger point with everything that we do is the registration page. Even if you're not selling a ticket for your audience within Hopin, still building out ticket types where you've got an online and a virtual attendee option that people can select, allows you to segment out those markets, and then you can then specifically target each one of those markets with customized emails, for example, messages that are going to be delivered that are directed specifically towards that use case. It's just another example of how you really do want to stop at the very beginning and really think that through in terms of what are the levels of participation and how am I going to make sure that I've got that bridge over that fence so that I am not wasting the option of having people be online, but not having that same experience from that the physical audience is going to have.
Yeah. And done right, it's going to simplify your life too. Because think about just say how you go about distributing the PowerPoint decks of speakers, or help vendors do handouts, right? If you have all people on-site and online all download the smartphone app and say, hey, that's where you get all the materials.
Right.
You're given one set of instructions to everybody instead of trying to come up with two sets of instructions because we didn't think about it in advance.
Right. Exactly. Yep. And you mentioned this a minute ago in terms of the smartphone app that Hopin has. That's again another very common trend with a lot of different platforms is having that virtual component. And there's a lot of reasons for that because of that connectivity that allows you can If you're physically on site, you can see who is registered for the event. You can potentially network with a virtual attendee, even if you're on site. You have all that ability. And then as a admin, as the manager and organizer of the event, all of that information flows into the reporting. And so if you have sponsors that you are providing data and information back to, or even your organization, that all becomes trackable data. And so there's a multiple level of benefit that you get when you start leveraging tools like that. Another one that I was going to mention too, that is also another newer company is called Boomset. That's also a company that Hopin has acquired, but Boomset's original design was more of the on-site, on-premise badging check-in type of a design. That is currently being incorporated into Hopin, so it's all going to be within a single ecosystem. But that provides benefits to you as a organizer, because it also allows you to set up things like QR codes. And so, getting back to the idea of making sure that everybody has their smartphone with the app downloaded, have a scannable QR code that people can go into and scan before they go into the keynote session or whatever it happens to be. That becomes trackable. And then you then have an active report of not only what people online are attending a specific session or a keynote or whatever stage it happens to be. You can also track that for the physical attendees as well too. So just really getting smart about the technology, leveraging that to your benefit, but then also to the benefit of making that bridge as seamless as possible to get interactions and value for your attendees.
All right. I'm going to add one thing before we kick out the third question here, but just because my heart, the center of my bullseye is speaker coaching. And, if we think about the three big P's, promotion, production, and presentation, all three have to fire on all cylinders to have a great event. Yeah. But two things that I think are often missed, and I alluded to this before, but part of getting ahead of the curve up front is how you prep your speakers to be inclusive of both audiences. And one of the things that I know Aaron is fond of saying that is that the StreamYard part of the Hopin family, that's the tool that's typically used for like the opening keynote. Well, one of the most common questions I've ever been asked in 20 years of doing this is, how do I engage an audience that I can't see? And my first automatic response is always set the stage early that you're different, right? Because otherwise they're going to just expect to sit there and be passive in your event, like they expect to sit there and be passive in all those other Chromium webinars that they've attended, right? Right. So coaching your speaker, for instance, giving them a tactic. And by the way, as a guy who's still an active part of National Speakers Association, I promise you that speakers want to look awesome in front of their audiences. So, just the ability, for instance, to bring in a question and display it on the screen for everybody to see could very well be something that's right up front in that opening keynote that goes, whoa, this is different. And the speaker sees me sitting out here in the virtual audience too. Right. Or whatever that might be. It doesn't have to be huge to make a big difference, because it sends a very different message in terms of saying, we see you. And by the way, those of you online are important to us. Right. Exactly. Some of them are getting, a lot of speakers are getting a little bit smarter, going, hey, and hello to our online audience too. But that's different than drawing them in and helping them be part of something. Right. Yep. That's just a huge part, I think, that's we can't entirely solve in production unless we then begin to intersect with the speakers and how the presentations unfold. Right.
And it starts right at the very beginning. From an attendee standpoint, when you first come into whatever the event that you've bought into, you've committed to spending your time sitting in front of a computer, participating in, seeing that level of interaction at the very beginning with what you are, with the event that you're going to be a part of or participating or listening to is very, very important, and it can completely drive your whole level of engagement. I love that feature of StreamYard that you were just talking about a minute ago, where you can take whatever comments are coming in and you can drop those right on the screen so that everyone can seize that. And it's interesting to me because it actually feeds upon itself, in terms of like people see that encourages them again to ask more questions, which again encourages that level of interaction, gets people off their hands, gets them involved. And to your point, having the speakers be able to acknowledge that and to see that reinforcement, it's no different than getting the applause of the people in the room with you. It's
Right.
that's that physical reaction back to you. That's exactly what this does. And it's hugely powerful.
Yeah. And, I think we already kind of touched on question 3 earlier, but I'll just even bring it up in the context of prepping speakers here, like what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
Question 3 is, how early in the planning cycle should we think through online options? And I think we probably already even answered that, so this can be pretty short. In just a second, I'll see if you've got anything to add before we get to question 4. But in the context of preparing speakers, one of the things that I have found is that it's not uncommon for speakers to have pre-existing expectations like audiences have pre-existing expectations, right? Even people who have spoken a lot probably haven't worked with production teams whose principle is, how can we help you do something else that grabs attention, right? Every speaker out there wants to be better at engaging, right? Just like you want them to be better at engaging. And yet, if it's an afterthought, sadly, one of the things that happens is their expectation is they're just going to show up and talk and you're going to do everything else instead. And that's not their heart. Their heart really is in the right place with wanting to. Sometimes they just haven't thought through how to do it, or they've been doing it on another platform. Whereas if you start early in the process and work with your event producer and program manager at virtual venues, to whatever, to go, oh, what are my options? And now how do we incorporate that into how we prep speakers? Every one of them wants to look good, and you want them to look good too, because that's a win-win for everybody.
Right. Ground floor. Very, very start of program creation, very start of actual design of the event itself. You really want to start that at the very beginning of all of those discussions because of the importance of it. I think I don't have anything to add to that. I think you've hit it on the head right
Useful
there.
to get your virtual event services crew or hybrid event services crew into the mix of planning as early as you can, just so you know what your options are, right? There's a lot more variables than probably what you know to be true with when you go to working with the onsite AV crew. But admittedly, question 4 here will sound a little self-serving, but I promise you we're going to be as objective as we can here. How should you approach specialty service vendors who do this kind of thing? And by the way, and I don't know that Aaron, if you were going to mention this, but Aaron's literally on an airplane just 4 days from now to go do a hybrid event for a client. And so how should you approach specialty service vendors who admittedly, like us, come alongside the crew that you've already got working to bridge that gap?
Yeah. I think that in our day and age, specialty vendors are there for a reason, and that's obviously that they're professionals with what they do, whatever that happens to be. And especially if you are talking about like the professional AV crew, in some ways it goes all the way back to that initial discussion that we were just talking about a few minutes ago about making sure that we're providing an atmosphere that is as engaging for the virtual as well as it is for the physical audience. A lot of that can directly tie into the quality of the production that is coming out of the room wherever you happen to be at. The last thing you really want to do is to just stick a camera in the back of the room, let it just roll and have that be the entire online experience that your audience is going to be having. That's not a very good experience. And so
how 2019
in some ways,
that is.
what?
I said how 2019 that is.
Exactly. I kind of think it's essential, in some ways, because I think we're at that level, the level of where virtual events are and the level of saturation that virtual events overall have had post-COVID makes incorporating and coming up with as high of a level of production as you can fairly important. And it's one of those key components, we believe, that can directly help to engage and increase that level of interaction. The other thing I was going to say too is that it's very common. You don't know what you don't know, right? And so even if you are very skilled with event management and organizing and stuff like that, there are technical elements of audio, visual, and broadcasting and streaming requirements. They frankly can be daunting to a lot of people that are doing this even professionally. And sometimes it can almost become more of like a black hole of costs where you don't really necessarily know what you need, what's the real value of what you're going to be getting, and whether or not it's worth what you're looking to do. And that's one of the things that we directly help with, because we have that level of background to be able to work directly with whoever that quality vendor happens to be, virtually or physically, from an online or a virtual vendor, to make sure that what is being designed, what is being proposed, what is being loaded in on event day is going to be what you need. And so I do think, Roger, to get back to your original question, I think that's fairly important. I don't think it's going to go away. Let me put it that way. Yeah. And the final thing I wanted to say too, that I think is worth pointing out as well too, is that professional doesn't always necessarily mean that you have to use a professional audio company, a professional streaming company. That's not necessarily what we mean when we say that. Being professional can also mean adhering to professional level processes of production and design and signal paths and things like that. We work with a lot of clients where, frankly, the budget is not where it needs to be to allow them to bring in some larger, higher profile AV company that could do this, which is completely fine. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to work within the means, but then also make sure that we're hitting that level of production that is going to be at that level that it needs to be to get that message across to attendees.
That's a great point. And if the question on the table is how do we even approach a vendor, right? To be fair, sometimes we don't know what we don't know. But one of here's an aphorism I find useful that I think you'll find useful whether you talk to virtual venues or whoever else, which is to separate the what and the how, right? The what are my requirements, my dreams, the way that I would love for people to interact or that kind of thing. And then the how is now how are we going to go make that happen? And I'll share with you one example that touches down, I think, in the Hopin world, since that's what we're here to talk about today. Most professional event management or event production companies in a terrestrial sense have figured out some form of streaming or that kind of thing because COVID just forced everybody into it, right? But what I see as common is a default to the way that they have solved it, instead of first taking your requirements and then saying, what is the best platform? Because is that Hopin? Is that On24? Is that Zoom events or that kind of thing? Because sometimes the devil is in the details, or the distinction or differentiation is in the details. And here's one example of default versus Hopin, not uncommon in the last couple decades to have like a Twitter hashtag. And one of the ways you tried to bridge the gap between online and on site is by having a Twitter hashtag that everybody uses, except that not everybody uses Twitter. But what if, like in Hopin's case, everybody comes into the same mobile app, regardless of whether they're on site or online, and they can chat in the app and connect in the app and those kinds of things. It bridges that gap a whole lot better. And
Right.
to be honest, most event management companies, AV companies who have figured out some form of here's how we'll get it out to your virtual audience, may not have some of those details in mind,
Right.
because their
Right.
proposed solution just comes at it from a different way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's one of the, again, to be self-serving, I think that's one of the strengths that we have, is that we have an ability at V2 to be able to really kind of diagnose that, and to really understand not only, what should happen on site to make sure that the virtual audience is included and is provided the best possible outcome and signal and everything within the scope of what we're doing, but also, again, to your point, making sure and diagnosing that whatever that platform that the audience is on, in this case Hopin, is going to be the best and most effective solution for what the conference or event is looking to do. Absolutely. I think it's all kind of related to that value, diagnosing it early, but building from there.
So just to wrap this up and then head into our fifth question. When we're talking about on-site plus online, clearly that means a vendor like us comes in and very frequently intersects with either the audio video crew, and oftentimes that means like the hotel or the conference venue. Words of wisdom with regard to what a potential buyer should be thinking about with regard to coordinating vendors like that.
Yes. And a lot of times, so when you are talking about hotels, conference centers, a lot of times, if that's where you're going to have your event and that's where you decide to have your event, a lot of times as a part of your contract, you're going to be required to use the AV in-house vendor, whether it's a company that they have a relationship with, or it's a division within the conference center or whatever. You're going to probably be required to use that group. We very often with our clients sit on the very initial discovery calls with whoever that vendor is going to be, to go through, describe and define what is going on, both physically, but then also how that's going to be delivered. We very often will be going through gear lists and role and staffing calls to make sure. Obviously, the first thing we want to make sure of is are things properly in place, and are they properly designed so that we're not going to have a bad day? That's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that we want to make sure that we're being most economical with the spend that our clients are looking to outlay. I can actually even give you an example now of a client that we're working with that in January is going to be doing a international event, hybrid event. Same scenario. We have been working with that audio provider for several weeks now, and we have identified right about $6,000 of labor that is either redundant or is not actually needed because of the design that we're looking to do. And it's not saying that company, that AV company is purposely trying to just throw men and labor at that event. A lot of times this is just kind of that mindset of, okay, we have a hybrid event, so this is what we need. And they throw all of the possible gear that they think they might need into that quote. And that's kind of where we can go back through and help walk through that. Okay, we probably don't need that, or we're going to be doing this. We're going to be using StreamYard, or we're going to be putting the RTMP feed in directly, or whatever it happens to be. We can help to make sure that there's not going to be that overage, whether it's labor, whether it's gear, all the while making sure that we're not missing something so that we have a bad day when the actual event day comes around.
Yeah. So heading toward the finish line here, last question is, well, so how do we even begin to think about adapting the interactions and engagements that we...
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we've touched on some of this along the way. Any other thoughts there? Head cook and bottle washer?
Sorry.
Yeah, all good.
I think it's a big one, honestly. And that's one of the things that, going back to Hopin, I think that they have a very strong suit. is in the fact that they are very actively pushing third-party integrations, and all that is essentially providing API level integrations to where third-party apps that, going back to gamification actually, that are more designed for that gamification type of an idea, directly having those integrate into Hopin. Hopin, if you're familiar with it, has what we call the right rail on the right side of the platform, where on the right side is where you typically have polling or chat or things like that. And those integrations typically live on the right side. But they provide that other higher level of interaction, which is, again, what we're looking for. So we use systems like Slido. Mentimeter is another one that we use quite a bit. Picture mosaics. This was a very cool one. We just did an event probably about 2 or 3 months ago for a larger client, where you encourage your attendees to send a picture in, upload a picture into this app, and it will create a mosaic picture of all of the pictures that has been received for people to view. It's very cool, and it's a very inclusive thing to do. Who thought of that? I don't know, but it's kind of cool to have that be to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Even if you're talking about language translation or things like that, there's a lot. And in some ways, when you step back and look at it, it's Hopin in some of these platforms, they're never going to create something like picture mosaics. They're never going to create a Slido type of an engagement or leaderboard.
Bingo.
They're very smart, though, to create an ecosystem that others can then plug into. And as a event producer, organizer, having that ability to incorporate those things that are going to make sense with your audience, that can be huge. So I'm very bullish on that. And I think it's a great way to really spice up your event.
Yeah. And, earlier I mentioned the knowing your what before your how, because this is what we do all the time, and it's hard for us to keep up with all the options, right? So if you feel a little overwhelmed by not only all the primary vendors, let alone secondary options, you're not alone. Let me give you a 3-step process that I use. I do this when I'm doing one-on-one speaker coaching, and I've done it for literally Fortune 500 company, working with their instructional design team at, I won't leave them on, I won't name them, but I'll say this: grab your pen, 3 words: analyze, adapt, discover. Yeah. Now, actually, there's an academic underpinning here that I'm going to spare you. But as a doctoral student, I kind of think that way sometimes. But literally, the very first question that I ask is, tell me all of the things that you would like to do in person. How does somebody get introduced? How do you like to handle handouts? If you stop for, if somebody randomly raises their hand in the front row during the presentation or shouts something out, how do you handle that question? Anything that you can think of that is particularly about human connectedness. Well, how does that happen in person? Analyze that stuff first. And then we come and we map it and adapt it to the features that we have within the platform, or we go looking for the features that will deliver on that. And then finally, the discovery process is that there are always things you can do better, faster, or different online than offline. Right? Because any change of medium actually changes something. And as human beings, socially, we notice, or sociologically, we notice what we lose before we notice what we gain. Right? So we first think about, you can't do this online, or you can't do that online. But there's actually things you can do better online. And so it's not a right or a wrong, it's a different. But if you'll start with your what, and then we start thinking about the how, analyze, map, and then discover what you could do new, better, or different. Because as Aaron said earlier, sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and you get in and go, oh, yeah, Hopin's got this cool little feature that would do, hadn't even thought about that, right? And it becomes this breathing entity. But if you don't know your what and your why right up front, sometimes that bogs down. So I'll leave it with this as the bottom line, Aaron. What How would you bottom line this as we wrap up here?
I think that it is natural to look at hybrid events, first of all, just in its own self, to look at hybrid events or virtual environments to be more of a daunting task, a complex task. And it can be, but if you, at the very beginning, develop and cultivate that mindset of really thinking through what are the goals, what's the intent, going back again to the messaging, developing your design from that, and then making sure that you're incorporating and using the best possible resources that are available to you, I think you're gonna be surprised with how far you go. There always is going to be that potential of disconnect, which is what we've been talking about here, from physical to virtual. That's always going to be here. Maybe when we start talking about, where things are going from a trend standpoint, a couple years down the road, maybe that's going to be slightly less of a, hard and fast rule, but it's what we live with right now. And so being conscious of that, not ignoring it, but finding ways to actively encourage the ability for people to get over that fence so that they can collaborate, they can share, they can grow, they can learn. That's going to lead you farther and farther ahead than you normally would if you're just hopeful just to set a camera up in the back of the room and just let it go. And the last thing I would leave with, Roger, is that what we try to do at V2 is we try to make sure that we're helping our clients to think through all of that. And again, it can be quite a bit, but the end result is almost always going to be way, way more impactful and important and successful by giving in and giving it that initial attention at the very beginning.
Yeah. And I'll just leave this with the final word as we say goodbye. Obviously, we at Virtual Venues, you can find us at virtualvenues.com, are happy to help. And by the way, if you go there, you'll find direct contact information for Aaron and us. That's how hands-on and available we are. But the thing that I'll leave you with is this. One of the things that you might not really expect from a vendor like Virtual Venues is that we're happy to hop in, pun fully intended, we're happy to hop in the process with you really early on and help you figure out if we're the right vendor for you. Yeah. Believe it or not, we think of service as something that happens before you ever sign a contract. So I would encourage you just to, give a call. There's way more obviously that we could talk about that isn't on the website or what we talked about here in 45 minutes. But with that, I would really encourage you to start with your what and then get to your why. And as Aaron said right up front, right? It's about your content and it's about how you help people have an experience and connect with people, which has a little additional complexity when we're connecting on site with online, but it can be done in a way that will really wow your audience and be way different than some old webinar. With that, we really appreciate your time today, and we will catch you on the next episode of Virtual Venues Thought Leader Conversations series. Have a great day.